What if I were to tell you that everything you know, everything you love, everything you cherish, from your favorite meal at your favorite restaurant to those nights after a long hard day cuddling up with your special somebody, turning on Netflix or watching your favorite TV show, was all built around a lie?
Our differences worldwide would vanish
my whole life.
if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
In part one, we uncovered how a group of Yale elites who called themselves the Skull and Bones would go on to create the entire backbone of America's intelligence apparatus. Okay, so let's pick up right where we left off. After World War II, the United States had a decision to make. How do you stay on top of the world? The country had the economic firepower, the industrial capacity, and after the war, it had a maturing intelligence apparatus. But what it didn't have was a long-term plan to maintain the power once the battlefield went quiet. So, in 1947, President Truman shuts down the wartime OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and replaces it with something far more permanent, the CIA. It's created under the National Security Act of 1947, and with that, the world's first peacetime intelligence agency is born, not to serve transparency, but to serve secrecy. Behind the scenes, men like Alan Dulles and James Jesus Angleton are pulling strings. Now remember James Jesus Angleton, because he's going to come up again soon. And they knew from the very beginning, if advanced technology ever came into American hands, be it foreign or not from this earth, then it couldn't be stored in government archives. It needed to go into the private sector. Why? Because private companies are exempt from FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. And so begins the outsourcing of secrecy. A pipeline of recovered materials, theories, propulsion systems, and unacknowledged research quietly begins to funnel into legally protected vaults. But they couldn't just hide it. They had to convince the public to stop asking questions. Right after Roswell, the Air Force launches Project Sign in 1948. Project Sign's purpose was to determine whether UFOs posed a threat to national security and to evaluate their potential origin, including the possibility of being extraterrestrial. However, the team's initial conclusion? Some sightings appear to be real, unexplained, possibly non-terrestrial. But just like that, the program is shut down. It's replaced by Project Grusch, which exists for one reason only: to discredit everything.
And now I'll ask Officer Stein and his colleagues to escort the accused into the room so that we may all look upon the guilty party. Don't get him too close to me, please. Now, this just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
Any witness who steps forward is ridiculed. Any report with merit is buried. The media is steered away. The goal wasn't to learn, it was to shut the public up. By 1952, they roll out Project Blue Book, which was billed as a serious scientific investigation, but in reality, it was just another filter. The best reports were quietly pulled from the public record, and the public-facing explanations? Weather balloons, swamp gas, and Venus.
There was a young lady from Venus whose body was shaped like a captain.
But it doesn't stop there. In 1953, the CIA commissions the Robertson Panel. This is where things go full PSYOP. The panel's recommendation is clear. Begin a full psychological operation on the American people to discredit the UFO subject using television, Hollywood, cartoons, and ridicule. They wanted to make sure this topic never left the fringes. In the late 1960s, the Condon Committee is launched to evaluate UFO reports. Sounds good? Except letters later revealed that the head of the committee promised the Air Force a dismissive conclusion before the study even began. It was a setup. In a memo dated August 9th, 1966, a Robert J. Lowe would write, "Our study would be conducted almost exclusively by non-believers who, although they couldn't possibly prove a negative result, could and probably would add an impressive body of evidence that there is no reality to the observations. The trick would be, I think, to describe the project so that, to the public, it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. One way to do this would be to stress investigation, not of the physical phenomena, but rather of the people who do the observing, the psychology and sociology of persons and groups who report seeing UFOs. If the emphasis were put here, rather than on examination of the old question of the physical reality of the saucer, I think the scientific community would quickly get the message. This is egregious. In other words, he's saying, we'll make this look like a natural investigation for the public, but behind the scenes, we'll stack it with skeptics to ensure the outcome dismisses UFOs, focusing on discrediting the witnesses, not the phenomenon itself. That way, the scientific community will know we're not taking this seriously. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a scientist on both Blue Book and Condon, realized what was happening. He'd go on to do a full 180, exposing the disinformation efforts from the inside. So while the public laughed, the government classified. While you were taught to roll your eyes, researchers behind the scenes were studying metals, energy signatures, and crash sites. Now, let's come back to the tech. In 1949, just 2 years after Roswell, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base quietly contracts Battelle Memorial Institute to begin a comprehensive study of titanium alloys. The focus? Nickel-titanium combinations. We now call it nitinol, a shape memory alloy that bends, folds, and instantly snaps back into its original form when heated. Now get this. This is exactly how Roswell witnesses described some of the wreckage. You can read the progress reports from Battelle. They're real, they exist, and they match the timeline perfectly. Wright-Patterson was allegedly housing the wreckage. Battelle gets the contract, and 2 years later, the first research begins. Now, I'm not saying Battelle was quietly working on alien tech, but if you're trying to trace the quiet absorption of off-world materials into black budget science, this is where you'd start. Meanwhile, the intelligence apparatus grows bolder. The military-industrial complex takes form. The Cold War gives them every excuse they need to hide behind national security. And by the early 1960s, we arrive at the first real threat to that system. President John F. Kennedy.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings, that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the dangers which are cited to justify it. There is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control.
JFK comes into office with a vision of peace. He doesn't trust the intelligence community. He refuses to support airstrikes during the CIA's Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba, which leads to American deaths and total mission failure. Allen Dulles is furious, and then Kennedy fires him. Not long after, JFK gives his famous speech about secret societies, secret oaths, and the importance of a free and open government. Then word starts circulating. Kennedy wants to dismantle the CIA, to splinter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. He begins pursuing diplomacy with the Soviets. He talks nuclear test bans, and most importantly, he threatens the growing intelligence oil defense network that had been building since 1947. And then, on November 22nd, 1963, JFK is assassinated. Following the assassination, the US government established an investigative body known as the Warren Commission. Its purpose was to examine the circumstances surrounding the president's death. After nearly a year of inquiry, the commission concluded that a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted alone. Their report became the official narrative, but over time, many would come to question how thorough and truthful that narrative really was. And in a suspicious turn of events, Allen Dulles, the man JFK fired, is brought back to help oversee the Warren Commission. James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence chief, controls Oswald's file, and decades later, it comes out Angleton lied under oath.
One newly declassified passage showed that Angleton had lied under oath about his surveillance of Oswald's correspondence while he lived in the Soviet Union from 1959 to 1962. And that, for me, was a tipping point. The transcript, which the CIA withheld from public view for half a century, confirmed a disturbing fact. James Angleton is the third senior CIA officer known to have lied under oath about what they knew about the alleged assassin Oswald before JFK was killed.
From 1954 to 1975, Angleton ran the counterintelligence staff, a position that made him one of the most powerful and secretive figures in the agency's history. Paranoid, brilliant, and utterly devoted to secrecy, he believed the real war wasn't fought on battlefields. It was fought in silence, in whispers, and in shadows. He moved in powerful circles, a member of the so-called Georgetown Set, an elite clique of Washington insiders who shaped foreign policy over cocktails and closed doors. That group included figures like Allen Dulles and W. Averill Harriman of Brown Brothers Harriman. Now, when I talk about people like James Angleton, Allen Dulles, and W. Averill Harriman, I'm not just name-dropping players in the background. These were architects, power brokers, men who shaped the very skeleton of America's modern intelligence structure. Harriman and the Bushes were Skull and Bones, Yale's elite secret society. Dulles and Angleton cut their teeth in the OSS during World War II, laying the foundation for what would become the CIA. These men weren't stepping into power in the 60s. They were the power. They built it. They were the system. So when JFK came along, a president threatening to cut off their funding, dissolve their agency, and expose their secrets, they didn't just see a political opponent. They saw a threat to everything they'd constructed. But the tension between Kennedy and the intelligence community had been building for years, and by 1963, it was reaching a breaking point. Because back in 1961, just months into his presidency, Kennedy had already started making bold moves behind the scenes. Not just pushing back against the CIA's authority, but requesting access to something far more secret. Something that, if real, represents the most tightly held intelligence the US government has ever concealed. Because in this memo, dated June 28, 1961, appears to show President John F. Kennedy requesting direct access to a covert program known as MJ-12. It's addressed to the then CIA Director Allen Dulles, and if real, it changes everything. Now, for many of you, the mere mention of Majestic 12 will have you checking out at this point. I too had and still do have some reservations in regards to the totality of the MJ-12 documents. However, this document is one of the few that have some striking corroborations that point to its legitimacy. Majestic 12 was said to be a secret working group formed in 1947 to manage the recovery, secrecy, and analysis of non-terrestrial technology. Now, here's where it gets strange. In 2022, a verified government document, National Security Action Memorandum 55, and also dated June 28, 1961, was officially declassified. In it, he's saying, "You're my main military guys, and I expect your advice to come to me directly, not filtered through intermediaries like the CIA or bureaucrats." This is essentially the public-facing version of the MJ-12 document. Now, let me show you something. If you see here, it was dispatched June 29th at 3:21 p.m. The NSAM 55 document was dispatched on June 29th, 1961 at 3:01 p.m. You might be connecting the dots already, but let's make this crystal clear. The MJ-12 document only surfaced publicly in 1987. 35 years before the declassification of NSAM 55. If the MJ-12 document were a forgery, the likelihood that the forger could have accurately mirrored the content and timing of a then classified presidential directive is astronomically low. Adding to this, a recently declassified calendar entry reveals that CIA Director Allen Dulles met with President Kennedy twice on that very day, June 28, 1961. This timing aligns closely with the issuance of both the MJ-12 memo and NSAM 55, suggesting a coordinated effort by JFK to assert greater control over covert operations and demand transparency from the intelligence community. This is huge.
James Angleton, before he died, was talking about Dulles and Helms and the others, what he called the Grand Masters. And he's a Catholic. Angleton was a Catholic, in search perhaps of repentance before his death. He did say, quote, "If you were in a room with them, you were in a room full of people that you had to believe would deservedly end up in hell. I guess I will see them soon."
So why bring JFK into this at all? Well, in the end, Kennedy's death didn't just silence a man. It marked the point of no return. The networks he challenged didn't disappear, they fortified. Shielded by secrecy, emboldened by war, they embedded themselves into every corridor of power. No president since has dared to push back with the same force. And from that moment on, the machine only grew.
Oh. Rock and roll.
And so that brings us to the 21st century. Where are we now? Well, the architects of the post-World War II global order, figures like Allen Dulles, James Jesus Angleton, and their network of intelligence operatives, financiers, and policymakers, engineered a system to ensure the United States and its allies remained at the top. Through globalization and neocolonialism, they staged coups, backed assassinations, and disrupted any attempt by resource-rich nations to take control of their own futures. The system they built guaranteed that wealth would flow upward, consolidating power, enriching defense contractors, and ensuring US dominance. But the world is changing. China, once one of the world's poorest countries, is now the leading global economy by purchasing power parity. Its rise, along with other nations reclaiming sovereignty over their resources, is viewed by many in the West as a direct threat to the old order. And amid this backdrop of global shifts, cracks began to show in the wall of secrecy. In 2017, the New York Times published a front-page expose confirming the Pentagon's secret UFO study program, ATIP, and released military footage of unidentified craft with flight characteristics that defy explanation. For the first time in modern history, the US government publicly acknowledged that something unexplained was happening in the skies. From there, the dam began to break. The Department of Defense established the UAP Task Force. Then came AARO. Intelligence official David Grusch came forward under oath, testifying that secret crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs had been operating for decades without oversight. Lawmakers responded. The Schumer-Rounds UAP Disclosure Act was introduced to compel the release of UAP-related material. Bipartisan hearings followed. Representatives like Anna Paulina Luna, Eric Burleson, Matt Gaetz, and Tim Burchett pressed for answers. For the first time, the UFO conversation was happening on the floor of Congress. And it wasn't a joke. But it hasn't all been progress. There have been coordinated attempts to stall and derail this momentum. Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, head of AARO during much of this recent activity, publicly dismissed claims of non-human craft and referred to whistleblowers as a small group of interconnected believers. But his credibility took a hit fast. Here in this clip, New York Post journalist and vocal UFO skeptic Stephen Greenstreet asks Kirkpatrick whether he attended a classified UAP briefing in Washington, D.C. back in 2018.
When I asked Kirkpatrick if he had a previous history working with UFOs, or if he had any previous associations with members of this core group of true believers. Before Arrow, did you have any interest at all in UFOs?
Not beyond the occasional movie.
Okay. Before Arrow, did you perform any duties regarding UFOs or paranormal phenomena?
No.
Did you attend a 2018 Senate Armed Services Committee briefing on Skinwalker Ranch? I asked him this question because in a previous report of mine, I revealed that in 2018, Brandon Fugel, the owner of Skinwalker Ranch, went to Washington, D.C. and gave a briefing to multiple Pentagon officials about the spooky stuff at the ranch. At the briefing were some of the members of this group. Fugel told me Kirkpatrick was not only there, but was leading the briefing about Skinwalker Ranch. Did you attend a 2018 Senate Armed Services Committee briefing on Skinwalker Ranch?
No.
However, very soon after this, photographic evidence surfaced placing him in the room.
Here you have Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who was appointed the task of leading the most recent mandated review by Congress relative to these topics, the UFO phenomena and other high strangeness. And he goes on record with the New York Post stating that, number one, he'd never met me. He didn't even know who I was. He'd never met Brandon Fugel. Number two, he'd never attended a briefing relative to Skinwalker Ranch in his life. Number three, he stated unambiguously that he had no interest in these topics before 2022. And here we have a briefing in April of 2018. In April of 2018, we are summoned to DC, to Washington, DC, to provide testimony to certain committees where he was in attendance. And we spent 2.5 hours in that briefing. And I sat right across from him. I mean, we're talking eye to eye, right across from each other for 2.5 hours. So Dr. Kirkpatrick, for whatever reason, has amnesia, has selective amnesia, that he'd never met me, pleaded ignorance, and that he'd never attended a briefing relative to Skinwalker Ranch or never had any interest in these topics before 2022, yet he's attending a confidential briefing in Washington, D.C. that we had carefully orchestrated.
And then came another misstep. Kirkpatrick was questioned about the now famous gimbal footage, one of the Navy's most widely circulated UAP videos, and he got the facts embarrassingly wrong. Here, I'll let you watch the clip.
Because a lot of that is glare that you're also getting off of the reflection. That's why it's so apparently hot. Because you have to now do the sun angles off of that.
This was at night, first of all.
Okay, it was at night. That's right. This is the gimbal.
This happened 10 minutes after the Go Fast video, 100, 200, 300 nautical miles off the coast of Florida, and there's no balloon trajectory. We looked at every single possible. There's no plausible within the lines of sight, right? Within the AT FLIR lines of sight, that's the elevation and the azimuth. There's no plausible balloon trajectory within the lines of sight.
Okay, well, I would have.
Well, let's move on. I've got a lot more. Just briefly, quickly on Go Fast.
Okay.
NASA did not account for wind. That's a massive scientific error. And when you account for wind, you get a speed. If you're assuming the range is correct and this object was at 13,000 feet, you get a speed that's closer to 100 knots, 120 miles an hour. That's a pretty stunning error on NASA's part, I think.
Well,
planes don't fly in vacuums, right?
I haven't looked at NASA's analysis.
You have not looked at NASA's analysis. Okay.
These moments don't come from fringe theorists. They come from insiders, analysts, and skeptics. And they all point to the same conclusion. Those in charge of disclosure are actively obstructing it. There are two competing factions at work here, one striving for controlled UFO disclosure, and the other fighting tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. But the shadiness doesn't end there. Remember this photo of Sean Kirkpatrick? See the woman standing behind him? Her name is Suzanne Goff, and she has one hell of a backstory. Goff is the longtime public affairs officer for the Department of Defense. She also has a background in psychological operations and information warfare. Many describe her as Kirkpatrick's handler. And here she is again, seated directly behind Dr. John Kozlowski, Kirkpatrick's successor as the head of Arrow. And it doesn't stop at media control, because in one of the only instances of its kind, Suzanne Goff intervened in FOIA requests related to UAPs. Now, during my research, I came across this recently FOIA'd Navy email, which reveals something very telling. In it, it states, and I quote, "Back in July, we received the attached briefing card from Joseph Gradisher and Sue Goff on the UAP cases. They want to ensure all responses are coordinated with them at DoD PA before they are sent out." It shows that Sue Goff, along with the DoD, was actively inserting herself into the FOIA process on UAP-related cases. Normally, when a FOIA request is submitted, say, to the Navy, it's handled by the Navy. But with UAP requests, Goff stepped in, rerouting and controlling the release of information. That kind of interagency override is almost unheard of. It signals something extraordinary. The subject isn't just sensitive, it's managed like a battlefield. So ask yourself, if there's nothing to the UFO or UAP topic, if there's not a there, then why does the DoD want to insert itself into the FOIA process and insist on being its gatekeepers? Something doesn't add up. In my opinion, this is pretty damning. So, my friends, this is where we are. A final crossroads. On one side, a desperate grip onto an old world, on secrecy, on control, on scarcity. And on the other, the first real chance we've ever had to tear the door off of its hinges and step into something new. You know, I often see people say, okay, UFOs are real. So what? I still have to work on Monday. Or, okay, this is cool and all, but, you know, there's war in Ukraine, there's suffering in Gaza, the economy's crumbling to pieces. There's way more important things to worry about than UFOs. And hey, look, that's completely valid. Those are real struggles. But what no one often talks about is this. If the technology behind these craft are real, if it's truly being hidden away from us, then none of these struggles ever needed to happen. Because this isn't just about aliens flying around their spaceships and the government's all bad because they've been hiding that from us. No. It's about way more than that. It's about the physics. It's about the energy. Because these technologies, if harnessed, would have given us the power to generate near limitless clean energy. We could have desalinized our oceans. We could grow food almost anywhere. We could ship goods across the world almost free. No endless wars, no oil spills, no food insecurity, no working yourself into the grave for 90% of your life just for that 10% of frail, exhausted freedom at the end. No. Because what we're talking about isn't just disclosure. It's the end of manufactured scarcity. It's abundance. So when people ask, what can I do? The answer is simple. Talk about it. Ask questions. Share the truth. Challenge the silence. Because the only thing standing between this world and the world we deserve is us. Okay guys, well, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I know this one took a little bit longer than expected. I just wanted to include some of the newly uncovered stuff that came with the latest JFK release. Then I ended up getting sick twice. So, but I mean, all good now, and I'm finally getting into a proper rhythm with these videos, so I should be able to get them out a bit quicker. But if you enjoyed this, please give it a like, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and if you found any of this valuable, it'd mean a lot if you shared it around. I'd also love to hear any constructive feedback you have or suggestions on topics you'd like me to cover in the future. I've got some really awesome stuff lined up, like next video we're gonna dive real deep into the science behind UFOs. Like, I'm talking about concepts most people have never heard of, backed by peer-reviewed literature and grounded in real physics. So trust me, you're not going to want to miss out on that one. Alright, that's it from me. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon in the next video. Cheers.